Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you tuning in. Just, thanks for watching. So as we get started today, I just want to kind of run down the plan of what we want to do today so we can do the things that we need to do and go ahead and put the live class for this week behind us. Right, I have a couple big goals for us, and that's to kind of cover the important things that we need to cover for the lab that we didn't cover last week. So last week we, kind of got the basics in. We looked at some of the basic stuff when it came to, writing functions. We inserted some HTML with inner HTML. We were able to add that in with a button, and we were able to do various things to be able to add text. So what I would like to be able to do today is I'd like to be able to change style dynamically with JavaScript, and I'd like to be able to do a dynamic hover for an image rollover, which is, one of those popular things. And then with time remaining, we can just kind of do other stuff and talk about other stuff as we can kind of fit it in. So I want to make sure that we cover what we need to cover, and then we can throw some other stuff in there if we need to. So if you need to go back and review some of the stuff that we talked about last week, getting some questions from some of you all regarding the document.write function, and that is something that, that is an option for things for one way that you can insert text into your HTML page, right, to satisfy that insertion of a paragraph into your HTML page. Another way is the way that we did it last week, right, when we were using the inner HTML, right? So those are two different ways that we can do it. And that is one of the things, as we've discussed previously, that makes code in general challenging, is the fact that, we're thinking about, these problems that we want to solve, and then all of a sudden, right, we're left with, maybe a dozen different ways that we can solve these problems. And, it's about determining, well, which way do I want to solve the problem, and which way do I want, do I want to do this or do I want to do that? And so if you need to review any of the things that we talked about last week, don't forget that the recording of last week's live stream, it is up in the announcements. Just go back a week from today, and it is there for you to look at. So to get started off today, I want us to talk about the idea of, where is it? Changing style dynamically. And so changing style dynamically is actually relatively simple. We already know basically half of what we need to know to be able to change style dynamically. Really, probably even more than what we need to, more than half of what we need to know, based on what we learned last week. Right, and based on what we know about CSS, because what we're doing here in JavaScript is really based on, what was built in CSS. So we use the same properties, when we think about our, declaration block in CSS and all the rules with the properties and the values that we declare in CSS. We use the same properties in JavaScript to be able to change the style of something different, or to be able to change the style of something. We just write it a little bit differently. So it looks very similar to how it would look in CSS. It's just a little bit different. And we use the same kind of structure that we used last week. When we looked at, basically adding, we inserted our text a couple different ways last time, right? We inserted it when our page loaded, and, we saw that happen, and we also was able to insert it with a button and be able to do things with that. Right, so today what I'd like for us to do is be able to, maybe take multiple buttons and, maybe even do something a little bit fancier. Right, so I like to use color here. When it comes to, my demonstrations for changing style dynamically. Just because color is a lot more fun. It's kind of like what we talked about in the CSS module. Color is something that is more readily apparent. In your lab, I ask you to change font size. Font size is handled incredibly similarly. So it's just a little something extra that I ask you to figure out here. And I believe there is a demonstration of it in your module. So you're not really extending yourself too far from what we're doing here. But we just make stylistic changes using the .style function. Last week we talked about what we mean by element here. Element is just selecting the element. So last week we worked with document.getElement by ID. We talked about how when we refer to document, what we are basically talking about is the root of our DOM, or our document object model, right? That DOM has kind of persisted forward with this. It's been our friend for the last few modules. So we've had this DOM, this document object model, and we've said that the root of our DOM is our document in JavaScript. And that's basically, in our HTML, that would be our HTML tags. Right, so, it's the very outside root of our HTML skeleton from when we were developing all of that. But then from that document, we can find different things inside of our DOM by using that getElementById property that we talked about last week. So we could actually, that causes our JavaScript to, what we say, iterate through the DOM. Right, when we get into advanced classes and web development, we talk about, different ways that iteration happens. We talk about bubbling, and we talk about, all this kind of fancy stuff. For the time being, we don't have to worry about any of that, any of the hows, any of the behind the scenes as to, why things happen. We just understand that, basically when we are looking for something, it basically starts at those HTML tags, looks through the entire DOM of our site, and says, okay, I'm going to look for this particular ID in the site. One of the things that we also talked about last week, just as a little bit of a reference here, is that we talked about variables. We've used variables previously when we dealt with Python, although they were a little bit different when we dealt with Python. So I just want to refresh your memory here just a little bit as we are, getting ready to start writing some code here. But we've said in the past that a variable is essentially a container where we can store information. We called it a shoebox, a jar, a bag, right? Whatever kind of container that you can think of. That's basically the way that we can think of a variable, right? So it's a container, and on that container we put a label on it, and that label is the name of that variable. And as such, we kind of create a symbolic link between whatever's inside of that container and the label or the name that we put on that container. And so whenever we refer to the name that's on that container later on in our program, what we are referring to is the data that's contained inside of that program. And for our purposes, with what we're dealing with in JavaScript right now, a great use for that is to kind of save us some effort, right? Because document.getElementById, open parenthesis, open quote, some ID name, close quote, close parenthesis. That's a lot of text, right? And if I had to go and write out that every time I needed to use that, that's a lot of effort. But I can also store that in a variable and just refer to it by the variable name, and that's going to help me out a lot. And, I can also change the value of a variable on the fly if I need to. But by and large, for where we're at with variables at this moment with JavaScript, we don't really need to worry about that. We're good. Right? Whenever we're creating a variable, we have basically a two-step process. It is declaration and assignment, which is basically the same thing that we were doing in Python, right? We would create some name and set it equal to some value. The only difference here is that there is a keyword that we need to add to our JavaScript to let our JavaScript know that this is a variable. And we only have to do it one time when we declare it. And every other time we use that variable, we can just use the name of the variable, right? Just the first time we declare the variable, we have to use a keyword to let our browser know, as it is parsing our code, that we intend this to be a variable. Then it knows whenever it sees that name throughout the rest of our code that that is a variable. So what I would like to do here is I'm going to jump right over to a replit here. Got a brand new fresh replit here. Got it prepared and ready to go. I am going to start off by just kind of adding a little h1 here. And in that h1, I'm just going to write a little hello world. Right? Module, we're talking, what would that be? Like module 5, module 6, right? This is stuff we were doing a long time ago. Just super basics. Right? So we want to be able to set ourselves up for success. So I'm going to create an h1 here. I'm going to write hello world in there. And in order for me to be able to reference this h1 in my JavaScript with the way that we're doing it, just at this basic level, right? Of course, there are other ways that this can be done, right? But just as we're learning the basics here, in order for us to be able to reference this, I'm going to give it an ID. And the ID is going to be, let's say, hi, right, for the purposes here. Remember that an element can only have one ID, and a particular ID can only be assigned to one element, right? And that's why IDs are used for selectors like this as we're learning JavaScript, right? Because they're going to be unique selectors, so we don't have to worry about non-unique selectors and what we do with them. Right, so let's give ourselves 3 buttons here. And we're going to come back and we're going to add a 4th one later, just for fun. Let's add 3 buttons here. Button. We're going to give it an ID equals R. And we are going to put the text on it of red. And we're going to close that button. Now, I didn't have to add an ID here because we won't be addressing this button specifically in our JavaScript. We will be coming back to this tag, this opening button tag here, to add an event listener to this, so it knows that on click it knows which function to run. But just to keep things nice and understandable in our HTML here, we'll just go ahead and give it an ID. It's fine. We'll make another one for green. So button ID equals G. This will be our green button. And we'll have one for blue. And we'll give that an ID of B. And we'll put the text of blue on that button. So now when we run this here, we see we have our hello world text. We have 3 buttons here, red, green, and blue. If we want to make them a little more visually interesting, right, we can maybe try to work with emojis a little bit here, right? Like, there's a red circle. a green circle, and a blue circle that we could add to these buttons as well. That would give a little bit more of a stylistic intent to these, right, that are in our emoji palettes there. And if you're interested in how I did that, that is the Windows key on your keyboard, the key that looks like the Windows logo, and the semicolon key. If you, if you press those, that'll bring up your emoji keyboard, and you can just search for an emoji and do that. So now we have these three buttons, red, green, and blue, and we have our hello world. So our hello world is what we're going to be changing the color of. And when we click these buttons, we're going to be changing the color of the text to red, green, and blue. Right, so what I'd like to do with this is basically write a function that's going to set this text to one of these three colors. And we're essentially going to be writing one function for each color, right? And so then we can attach each function with an event listener to each of the different buttons. And, that's going to make life easy for us. Right? Nice and easy. Allows us to change the color of the text. And again, this is going to be very, very similar to how you would address font size as well. Right? So I'm going to jump into my JavaScript file here. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm actually going to want to create a variable. Right? And let's zoom into this so we can see this a little bit better. Because when we look at this element here, right, our element with the ID of hi, we would select that with document.getElementById hi. Right, which is all well and good, right? That's nice. But that's a lot of text. So what I'd rather probably do is put that into a variable. So whenever I wanted to reference that element, I didn't have to type out document.getElementById hi every single time, right? Because I'm going to have to put it in this button. I'm going to have to put it in this button. I'm going to have to put it in this button. So to save myself some work, I can put it in a variable, maybe give it a name T for text, and set that equal to document.getElementById hi. Right, so now whenever I write my function and I want to refer to document.getElementById hi, I can just put the name of my variable here, which is T. Right, nice and easy. So let's start off with our red function, and we'll create a function. So as we were discussing last week, one of the things that we want to do when we create a function, we want to start off with our function keyword, which is simply the word function. F-U-N-C-T-I-O-N. And then we give this function a name. Turn red. And actually, technically, there is another way that we can do this that would make this a little easier. Right? That would make us have to code less. Right? If we were doing it that way. Right? So let's do it. You know what? Let's do it the short way. Let's do it the short way. Let's do change color. Because we were talking about parameters last week. One of the things that we were talking about last week was the idea of parameters. And the fact that I can establish a parameter inside of these parentheses. Here for my function. So that when I call my function, I call it with some bit of data inside of the parentheses, and that data gets taken from the outside of the function and brought inside of the function. And so we compared it to like the pneumatic tube that you see at the bank, right? If you go to the line at the bank and you go and you wait outside of the bank in the, the drive-through, you need to send information inside to the bank. So, you get the little pneumatic tube out of the little door thingy, you put your information into it, you put it in there, you press the button, and it goes into the tube, into the bank, and then they can send it back out of the bank. And so that's what this parameter allows us to do. It allows us to put information in elsewhere and use this information kind of as a variable. So what I can do here is I can actually put the color in as a parameter. So I can put it in when I call the function so that it takes the place of the parameter. So I only actually have to write one function here, which is pretty useful. So I'm going to put my curly braces there. That was one of the things that we discussed last week, is that, a function is a block of code that does a specific thing. And that when I put curly braces there, it's like the curly braces that we put around a declaration block in CSS. Right? It's defining the beginning and the end of this function, or the beginning and the end of the lines of code that do a specific thing. So in this case, I'm going to select T, right? Because that's document.getElementById hi, and that's going to be my text. Dot style, and that tells it that, I'm going to be changing some kind of style about it. And then I can put dot, and I can put any CSS property after it. Just the only difference is, right, and this is key, the only difference is that, when we were writing CSS, if it was a 2-word property, we separated it with a hyphen, right? It was font-family. Or, whatever, font-color, or whatever, right? But in JavaScript, I don't separate it with a hyphen. I do what is called camel case, which means when I get to the start of the second word, I put it all together like it were one word, and that second word I uppercase. Right? So in this case, I go font, or in this case, we're just changing text color, so it's just the word color. But if I were to do font size, it would be font, uppercase S, I-Z-E. If I were to be changing the style of font, it would be font, uppercase F, A-M-I-L-Y. Right, so since we're just changing color here, color. And it's going to equal the property that we're sending in via the parameter. So in this case, it is col, C-O-L. And so now when I put my event listener onto my buttons, I will add my function name. I will put it there with a color name in between the parentheses in quotes. And then whenever I click that button, it will change that color. Right? That's all I need to do here. Right? The long way to do this would be to put this in quotes here. Right? If I wasn't going to do this, if I was going to do function change color or turn red t.style.color equals, and in quotes, red. Right? And I could do one for green and one for blue and apply the different functions to the different buttons, right? And if you do yours like that, that is more than good, right? That is great. Love that. In programming, we have some rules, especially when we get a little bit more advanced in our programming. We have a rule called DRY, D-R-Y. And dry stands for don't repeat yourself. So if we don't want to repeat ourselves and we want to write the most efficient and quick code possible, right, we get a little repetitive if we're writing a different function for each button. Whereas if we do things this way, we only have to write one function that covers everything. Right, so again, multiple ways to do the same thing. It's fine. You could do it either way, especially while you're learning. I'm okay with it. It's all good. Right, I go in here. I find my red. I'm going to add the on-click event listener. And I'm going to set that equal to change color. And in between the parentheses, I am going to put red. Right there. You'll notice I put that in single quotes. That's because I have double quotes around change color. And it doesn't impact. I put single quotes inside of double quotes so it doesn't impact the double quotes, right? And so I can actually use this same code. CV. This will be green. And this will be blue. So when you click the first button, it'll pass red in as the parameter. And red will become the value call. So it'll say t.style.color equals red. When you click the second button, our green button, it'll pass green in as the parameter. So green will become call. So it'll be t.style.color green. And do the thing. And then blue, likewise, t.style.color blue. So when we run this, we see red, green, blue. Red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green. You know, we can just click that as many times as we want. And we're changing the color of our font. We can do, you know, something very, very similar with font size, right? We just make a couple of small adjustments. And we have something that can change font size. Right now, I do want to do something interesting here. Though I want to do something a little bit different. I want to write another function. And I want to write a function color random. So if I wasn't going to do something like that, I want to write a button really quickly that's going to make that text a random color. That's going to be fun. Because that's something that people always like. And it also gets back to some of the ideas of, you know, it kind of helps us explain, you know, what we were doing with color a few weeks ago. Right? How color works. Because we said that, you know, oh, with color we have, you know, a red value, a green value, and a blue value. And the red value and the green value and the blue value are all flashlights that, you know, shine a value between 0 and 255 and this and that, right? So I can actually write a function that would give me a random color every single time. That I can attach to a button that can make that text a random color. And so in order to do that, I'm going to write 3 variables inside of this function. And I'm actually going to use these as let variables instead of var variables. Right? And we mentioned why we would do something like that last week. Right? We said var variables are global variables, whereas let variables are scoped for functions. So that means that these variables are only going to be these variables inside of this function. So every time this function runs, these variables will be created. And since we're creating a random number, it will create a new random number every time this function runs. All right, so it's just a little bit of fun. People like this kind of stuff. So we'll throw that in here. So we'll let R equal math.floor math.random times 255. And so we'll talk about what this does. And we'll work from the inside out. So math.random gives me an infinite value. Which is fun, because whenever I talk about math.random, we talk about this in some of the advanced programming classes, because there are, similar sort of functions in other programming classes or in other programming languages, and we also talk about it when we're talking about, JavaScript in depth. We'll talk about it in Web 115 in the spring, for those of you who continue on with me in the web programming and web development. We talk about math.random. What math.random does is math.random gives me a number between 0 and 1. Between 0 and 1. Now, how many numbers are between 0 and 1? Right? If you use that fast brain that you might have heard about, you might just be tempted to say, well, there's only one number there. It's 0 and, or there's two numbers there. It's 0 and 1. Right? But there's actually an infinity of numbers between 0 and 1, right? Because when we get into decimal numbers, floating point numbers, there is an infinity of numbers between 0 and 1. And so what I do to control my number range, I take that number between 0 and 1 and I multiply it by some other value. In this case, 255. Right? Because my value for my reds and greens and blues goes from 0, which is 255 times 0, to 255, which is 255 times 1. And every other value in between would give me some random value in between. Now, I don't necessarily want to have a fractional value. I don't want to have a floating point value here. And that's what math.floor does. Math.floor rounds my number down to the next lowest whole number. Right? So if it's 127.789, it's going to round it down to 127. If it is 65.098, it's going to be 65. Now I'm going to add something else to this here. I'm going to wrap all of this in parentheses again. And I'm going to add 2 string 16. And so what that's going to do is that's going to change it from a decimal number to a string that is written in hexadecimal. Or base 16, right? Remember back a couple weeks ago when we talked about color. We talked about hexadecimal. Right? Instead of 0 through 9, we have 0 through F. Right? So we have one number for red. One number for green, one number for blue. We will change this to green. And we will change this to blue. Right? Or G and B. So now every time we run this function, we will get a random number that will be converted to hexadecimal for red, for green, and for blue. So now all we have to do is we just put it into one value that we can add into this sort of statement. So t.style.color equals hashtag, right? Because remember back, we're talking about color, right? If we have a hexadecimal color, we always start it with the hashtag. And we concatenate the R value, the G value, and the B value. You know, you remember back to when we were working with Python and we did concatenation, where we took two strings and we put them together and we made one string. That's what we're doing here, right? We have string, string, string. We have 4 strings now, if we include the hashtag. So we're just taking all 4 of these strings and we're putting them together and we're making one string. And that one string is going to be some random hexadecimal value. So now all we have to do is take this function and attach it to another button. So let's add another button here. Button. ID equals, we'll call this one ran for random. On click equals, this is called color random. Color random. We'll make sure we put that in quotes so it actually, you know, works. And we'll put random in there. Since we have an emoji for the rest of them, let's put a little emoji in here for this one as well, just to kind of stay consistent with our design. Now, every single time we click that button, we will get a different color for Hello World that is being completely randomly generated by the function. Which we can see happening here. So red, green, blue, random color. Blue, green, red, random color. Right? Lots of fun. Super cool. And of course, as always, you know, I'll give you all this code when I put out the recording just so you all can see, you know, get a nice close-up on this so you can try to wrap your heads around this just a little bit more and see how all this works. Random colors. Fun, fun, fun. So looking at my So the only other thing that we really need to do is do an image rollover. And that'll get us kind of satisfied for our lab assignment. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to actually put an image into our site. Right? And so we learned this, you know, from a previous module, right? We know how to do this. So I've got my Cloudinary here. So I'm going to go into Cloudinary. I'm going to grab an image, right? And what do I normally use here? Something from the CTI 110 folder, probably. No. This one? No. You know what? These will work. I'll use this picture of a cell phone here, right? And I will, you know, click the copy URL button here to copy the URL to my clipboard. And since my buttons are inline elements as well as my images, I'll add a manual break here. And we'll add my image, img src equals quotes paste link, alt equals empty alt for decorative, and self-close to get our picture of a phone on our site. So this is an important part of our image rollover, is that we have to have somewhere to start. Right, so we have to have somewhere to start, so we have to have an image loaded onto our site to begin with. So what I recommend is adding an ID here. So if you don't already have an ID on it, add an ID. ID equals, we'll call it pic. You can call it whatever. Right, because you will be referencing this image. And so we have this URL here, and we're going to need this URL again. But we also want our other image. So let me grab another picture. I got this server rack here, so let's use that. Nice and visually different. And let's jump into our JavaScript. So we're going to write a function here. Function, and we can call it whatever we want, right? We'll call it img rollover. Right, and we'll add our curly braces here. And so what we're going to do here is we're actually going to change the attribute of our image element. And when we're changing an attribute, we're just going to refer to the attribute that we're changing. Right, in this case, it is source. So we're going to change the source attribute of our element with the ID of pic. Right, so it's going to be document dot get element by ID, and you could choose to do this as a variable as well if you'd like. No big deal. Pic dot src equals, and we paste the URL that we want our image to change to into there. And our function here is as simple as that. Right, the function that we're writing here is as simple as that. Although the event that we're using here is a little bit different. Right, because we're used to our click events, but we're not using a click event anymore. We're using an on-mouse enter event. Because when we think about a hover on a website, a hover is actually two separate events. And that's something that people don't really think about a lot. A hover is actually two separate events. It's our mouse entering an area, which triggers one thing, and then our mouse leaving an area, which triggers something else. Right, so in this case, what we want to do is we want to be able to tell our browser, basically, that when our mouse enters the area defined by this image, we want to change it to this other image. And when our mouse leaves the area defined by this image, we want to change it back to what it was initially. Right, so it's actually two separate things that we're doing here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add my on mouse enter event here. And we are going to attach my image rollover to that event listener. And if we did it right, we should know we did it right, because we should be able to roll over our image and it should change. Right, which we see happen here. Right, I took my mouse, I put it over my image, and it changed. The problem, when my mouse leaves the image, doesn't change back, right? because we only have half of the equation here. We've only done half of it. We have our on mouse enter listener here, but we don't have a listener for what happens when our mouse leaves. So all we have to do here is just change it back to what it was initially. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL. I can copy this entire function here. Right, and I have copy history enabled on my computer, so I can Windows key V to paste my function, Windows key V to paste my URL of my image, and we'll just call it img back. Right, everything else, so we changed the name of the function. The function name has to be different. And we changed the name of we changed the URL to the image. Now there are some other ways like around, doing all this. Like we can do this with one image if we want to, right? Kind of the way we did it here. Because if we look at this, right, the only thing that's changed is the file name. So if we put the file name in as a parameter, then we could get fancy with it. But we don't need to worry about that with where we're at. We just need to make sure that we add our on mouse leave event. So on mouse leave. We're going to set that equal to image back. And that completes our hover. Right? We've got our image rollover, doing half of our hover for when our mouse enters the area, and then our image leave, doing the other half of our hover event for when our mouse leaves the area. So we hover over, it changes, we leave the area, it changes back. And we could do that as much as we want. And we can still red, green, blue, throw up a random color in there. And if we wanted to, we could put a paragraph in here, give it an ID of insert, right, just to remind ourselves of last week. And in our JavaScript, not in a function this time, so it just loads when the page loads, we could document.get element by ID, insert dot inner HTML equals this text was inserted via JavaScript. Right, so now we have a line of text that was inserted via JavaScript. We have our image rollover, and we have buttons that control some CSS that can change. Just like the kind of thing that we're looking for when it comes to our lab assignment for this module. All right, we've even gone above and beyond here with this random color selector here, which is kind of fun. I just like doing random colors because people usually like random colors. I've got about a half a dozen different random color pickers that I like to pull out just every now and then. And anything that is, inserted by JavaScript here still gets styled by CSS, right? So if we style ID insert, for example, font size 24 pixels, makes it a lot bigger, right? Font family, do the font family on the asterisk selector that we've talked about previously. You know, high, we can make that even bigger, right? And even if we make it bigger, I put H1 instead of high. Even if we make it bigger, it's still going to change colors, right? Because it doesn't matter, because it's the JavaScript still selecting the same thing. We could even take, and we could even actually use different functions, do different things here, right? You know, lots of stuff that we could do here. So is there anything else that I want to make sure that I cover? Not really, I don't think. You know, I'm pretty sure we hit the big ones here. You know, the big thing again here coming out of this is that, you know, this is technically programming, right? So as you are working on this, on these assignments yourself, you know, the big thing is that you want to pay attention to what you're doing. Make sure you have the right characters in the right places, working with the right things in the right places. Uppercase, what's supposed to be uppercased. Lowercase, what's supposed to be lowercased. And working with, you know, whatever you need to work with to make sure that it works. There are different options to be able to do different things. At the end of the day, especially for this class, as long as it works, I'm good with it. And so since I think we've hit all the high points for everything that we need to make a successful lab here, I think that's where we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. Want to thank you for watching. We'll go ahead and if anybody in the chat live here with me has any questions, you know, if you want to go ahead and throw those out and ask, feel free. If you are watching the recording later on, and you have any questions, you know, feel free to send me an email or a Teams message, and, you know, we will, you know, do whatever we can to answer your question. We will, you know, hang out in the chat for a couple minutes here. You know, for the people in attendance live, just in case, you know, they think of any questions here as we're wrapping up. Turn the music back on for a few minutes here. But that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.